The winds over Hawaii carried a deceptive calm that April afternoon in 1988. The sun painted the Pacific in a soft gold sheen, and at Kahului Airport on the island of Maui, Aloha Airlines Flight 243 prepared for what should have been a routine 35-minute hop to Honolulu. Passengers boarded in shorts and vacation shirts, some carrying beach bags instead of carry-on luggage. On the ramp, ground crew chatted casually. Nothing suggested that within minutes, a Boeing 737 would become the center of one of the most shocking structural failures ever recorded in commercial aviation. At the controls sat Captain Mimi Tompkins, 34 years old, sharp-minded, composed, and respected for her discipline. Beside her, First Officer Gordon Cain, a seasoned aviator with calm speech and methodical habits. In the cabin, leading the flight attendants was Clarabelle C.B. Lansing, a veteran with decades of experience and a reputation for being both warm and commanding. If there was anyone who carried the soul of Aloha Airlines in her stride, it was Lansing. The aircraft they were flying, Boeing 737-297, tail number N73711, had a long history. Delivered in 1969, it had served for nearly 2 decades in one of the harshest environments for aluminum. Constant short-haul operations, salt-rich air, high humidity, and frequent pressurization cycles. More than 89,000 cycles had accumulated on the airframe, an extraordinary number for any aircraft of its generation. Yet on this day, no alarms sounded. No warnings blinked. The plane taxied like any other flight. Passengers settled into their seats, unaware that a network of microscopic fatigue cracks, hidden beneath layers of paint and routine maintenance, had been silently spreading along the fuselage for years. The aircraft lifted off at 13:25 local time. As it climbed through the warm tropical air, the Boeing felt stable, responsive, and unremarkable. Captain Tompkins leveled off at 24,000 feet, engaging the autopilot. The cockpit was calm. The crew prepared for the short cruise segment, fully expecting a smooth ride. What they didn't know was that beneath the skin of the aircraft, a chain of structural failures was waiting. Previous inspections had missed the warning signs. A technique used for corrosion control had unintentionally softened the skin in certain areas. Lap joints along the upper fuselage, held together by thousands of rivets, had begun separating over years of stress. One section in particular, just above the passenger cabin, had reached a critical threshold. A hairline fracture had grown wider under repeated pressurization, and Flight 243's climb added just enough differential pressure to push that crack to its breaking point. At 1:46 p.m., with the aircraft steady and passengers relaxing, the first sign of trouble emerged in the form of a faint metallic sound. Captain Tompkins didn't hear it. Neither did Cain. But passengers seated near the forward cabin sensed something, a vibration, a subtle shift in air movement. No one could pinpoint it. No one had reason to worry. Seconds later, the cockpit voice recorder captured a sudden, violent change in the soundscape. A low rumble snapped into a deafening roar. A pressure wave slammed through the cabin. In an instant, the entire upper fuselage between the cockpit and the wings tore open, ripping away like the lid of a can. What had been a sealed, temperature-controlled passenger cabin was now an open-air shell hurtling through the sky at nearly 300 knots. It happened too fast for the mind to process. 1 second, passengers were chatting. The next, they were staring at clouds rushing past inches from their faces. The force of the decompression was catastrophic. C.B. Lansing, who had been standing near row 5, was pulled violently upward. She vanished instantly. The wind, the pressure differential, and the structural collapse combined with lethal force. Passengers watched in shock as the cabin ceiling, insulation, wiring, and debris were sucked into the sky. Inside the cockpit, the explosion of sound was overwhelming. The glare shield flexed. The windshield bowed. Papers whipped around. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp tone. Cain shouted. Tompkins fought to keep her hands on the controls as the aircraft pitched and rolled under the sudden aerodynamic distortion. They had lost a massive portion of their fuselage. Yet impossibly, the aircraft had not broken apart. Cain tried to speak, but the slipstream noise made words nearly unintelligible. Tompkins pushed the nose down to initiate an emergency descent. Oxygen masks had deployed, except in the forward section where the entire overhead structure had been ripped away. Passengers were exposed to gale-force winds. Hair whipped violently. Breath came in gasps. Some gripped their armrests so tightly their fingernails tore. Others instinctively ducked. The cabin crew, those who remained alive and conscious, crawled across the floor, shouting instructions that were lost in the wind. The cockpit became the center of the struggle for survival. Tompkins, realizing the severity of the structural loss, knew that speed was now the enemy. The faster the aircraft moved, the greater the aerodynamic stress on what remained of the fuselage. She brought the throttles back, fighting to stabilize the aircraft at a speed low enough to prevent further structural failure, but high enough to maintain control authority. The noise was overwhelming. The aircraft felt unstable, yet the crew had no time for fear. They had collapsed hierarchy, cut through every unnecessary protocol, and committed to a single unified mission: put the 737 on the ground. Tompkins radioed Honolulu Center. Her voice, shaking and barely audible through the wind, delivered words that controllers strained to understand. Aloha 243. We're unpressurized. We have structural failure. It was an understatement of historic proportions. On the ground, controllers and emergency crews scrambled. Pilots and other aircraft listened in stunned disbelief. A structural failure of that magnitude at altitude should have meant total destruction. Yet Flight 243 was still flying. Cain worked the radios while scanning the instruments. The airspeed fluctuated. The control columns transmitted vibrations through their grip. They were essentially flying a crippled, partially open-air aircraft with unpredictable aerodynamics and no clear sense of what other systems might fail. Back in the cabin, passengers clung to hope. Some prayed. Some cried. Others sat in shock, staring at the jagged, gaping hole where the ceiling had once been. The Hawaiian wind howled through the cabin like a monstrous engine. Every passenger knew intuitively that the situation was far beyond any typical emergency. They were exposed to open sky at 24,000 feet in a jet that had lost the very structure that kept it whole. The flight attendants, battling wind and debris, began moving seat to seat, checking for injuries. Several passengers near the front were covered in fiberglass insulation. Others bled from head wounds caused by flying debris. The noise made communication nearly impossible, but the crew pushed forward with instinctive coordination. Their training had prepared them for decompressions, fires, medical events. Not for half the aircraft to disappear mid-flight. Yet they acted with relentless focus. In the cockpit, Tompkins chose Kahului for an emergency landing. The aircraft was closer to Maui than Honolulu, and every additional minute in the air increased the risk of further structural collapse. She began a controlled descent toward the island, the mountains visible through the fractured windshield. Cain called out altitude readings. Tompkins adjusted pitch cautiously. The surviving structure groaned under fluctuating stress loads. The airflow over the exposed fuselage created new turbulence patterns. Yet she kept the aircraft stable. Despite the chaos, neither pilot succumbed to tunnel vision, a common human factor failure in catastrophic events. Instead, they maintained constant cross-checking of instruments and verbalizing their actions. This was CRM at its highest possible level: communication, coordination, and decision-making under maximum stress. But fate had brought them into this crisis because CRM had failed long before takeoff. Years of maintenance oversight, ambiguous inspection protocols, and organizational blind spots had built a system where no single technician or supervisor saw the complete picture. Tiny cracks had been dismissed as cosmetic. Pressurization cycles had been underestimated. Reports had been filed but not linked. Each person trusted that someone else, somewhere else, had confirmed structural integrity. The cockpit now faced the consequences of those systemic human errors. Wind tore through the exposed cabin. The engines surged as Tompkins adjusted for approach. She lowered the landing gear, and a loud thud reverberated through the aircraft. For a heart-stopping moment, the nose pitched down, then recovered. Cain monitored airspeed. Too slow, and they would stall. Too fast, and the aircraft could disintegrate. The airport came into view. Fire trucks lined the runway. The island's emergency services had mobilized with breathtaking speed. Cain announced over the intercom, his voice nearly lost in the wind, "Brace." Flight attendants signaled passengers with hand gestures. People bent forward, gripping their legs. Some cried out. Some squeezed their neighbor's hand. All waited. Tompkins brought the aircraft toward the runway with surgical precision. The 737 shuddered violently. She held it steady, seconds to impact. The crippled jet cut through the air over Maui, wounded yet fighting to survive. As Aloha Airlines Flight 243 descended toward Kahului, the roar of the wind grew even more intense. The forward section of the fuselage, now torn open from the cockpit to roughly the fifth row of seats, vibrated with unpredictable force. What remained of the aircraft's structure strained against the aerodynamic loads. Captain Mimi Tompkins felt every shudder through the control column. The 737 was holding together, but barely. Every second mattered. Below them, Maui's rugged coastline rose from the Pacific like a jagged shield. Kahului Airport lay in the center of a broad valley between the Haleakala volcano and the West Maui Mountains. The terrain was both a blessing and a challenge. While the airport was close, the winds that funneled through the valley could be vicious. Tompkins knew she had almost no margin for error. A gust at the wrong moment could twist the crippled Boeing beyond the limits of what remained of its fuselage. Inside the cabin, chaos had evolved into a fragile pattern of survival. Flight attendants clung to seats and armrests as they made their way through the debris-littered aisle. Passengers near the front still had no ceiling above them, only open sky. Most oxygen masks had deployed, but where the ceiling had torn off, the system was gone entirely. The flight attendants distributed portable bottles to those struggling to breathe. Communication was nearly impossible. They used gestures, eye contact, and touch, an improvised choreography of emergency response. The passengers themselves were a study in human resilience. Some were petrified, gripping their seats with white knuckles, tears streaking across their wind-burned faces. Others were eerily calm, locked in a kind of stunned acceptance. Parents shielded their children. Strangers held hands. Despite the terror, the cabin didn't descend into madness. Instead, it moved into a silent pact of mutual endurance. Back in the cockpit, First Officer Gordon Cain fought to interpret what few instruments were still reliable. The impact of the decompression had scrambled several indicators. Some dials fluctuated wildly. Others froze altogether. Even so, Cain's methodical nature kept him focused. He called out airspeeds, altitudes, and headings as clearly as he could, knowing that Tompkins was flying through pure instinct supplemented by whatever data she could trust. Tompkins called for flaps. Cain selected the appropriate setting. The moment he moved the lever, the aircraft shook again, an unsettling tremor that forced both pilots to reassess. Flaps increased lift, but also increased structural stress. The 737's wings were intact, but the airflow over the torn fuselage changed the aerodynamics in ways they could not predict. For a brief moment, the nose dipped, and Tompkins corrected it with steady pressure. She wasn't flying a normal approach. She was wrestling an aircraft that had lost part of its structural backbone. Controllers on the ground watched the radar echo in disbelief. They had received only fragments of Tompkins's transmission earlier, but the words structural failure had sent shockwaves through the operations center. Fire and rescue crews had positioned themselves along the runway. Ambulances waited. Medical teams stood with stretchers, trauma kits, and oxygen tanks, ready for mass casualties. At 13:58, Flight 243 turned on a final approach. The view from the cockpit was surreal. The wind howled through the tear behind them. The sun glinted off jagged metal edges where the fuselage skin had peeled away. Loose wiring whipped in the slipstream behind the cockpit bulkhead. Tompkins and Cain were essentially flying exposed to the elements, a near unthinkable scenario for a commercial jet. Cain monitored the throttle. Tompkins stabilized the descent. The aircraft was high but stable enough to land. She lowered the nose slightly, committing to the runway. In the fractured cabin, passengers saw the runway below. Despite the terror, a sense of impending survival began to build. Flight attendants signaled the brace position again. Many passengers were already hunched forward, gripping their legs. Tompkins aligned the aircraft perfectly with the center line. She pulled back gently, bleeding off speed. The 737 trembled one last time, and then touched down. The landing gear thumped against the runway with more force than usual, but the jet held. Smoke billowed as the tires met the asphalt. Tompkins deployed the spoilers manually, unsure if the automatic system would work after the structural trauma. Cain applied the brakes. The aircraft decelerated rapidly. Wind tore through the open fuselage, but the jet remained stable. Fire trucks raced along the runway beside them, keeping pace. When the aircraft finally came to a stop, a strange silence filled the cockpit, a silence broken only by the relentless roar of the open-air cabin behind them. The ordeal was not over. Tompkins immediately shut down the engines. Cain initiated the evacuation. The emergency slides deployed. Flight attendants moved with urgency, guiding passengers out. Those near the rear exited through usable doors. Those near the front climbed out onto the wing or were directed to the aft exits. Medical teams sprinted toward the aircraft. Firefighters stabilized the structure, fearing it might collapse. Passengers limped away, some dazed, some injured, all shaken. Inside the cabin, debris covered the floor, fiberglass insulation, shattered interior panels, luggage and fragments of ceiling. Yet somehow, the majority of occupants were alive. Miraculously, out of 95 souls on board, only one person had been lost. C.B. Lansing, the veteran flight attendant whose dedication to service had defined her career. Her disappearance during the decompression was a wound that would linger in the memory of everyone who survived. The wind across the exposed fuselage continued to moan even after the aircraft stopped. The torn metal edges vibrated in the breeze, producing a hollow, haunting note. Tompkins and Cain descended the ladder alongside emergency crews. Their faces were streaked with windburn and exhaustion. They had flown through one of the most catastrophic failures in aviation history and delivered a crippled aircraft safely to the ground. In the coming hours, passengers were transported to hospitals for evaluation. Airplane photographers, investigators, and local journalists arrived at the airport. News began to spread across the world. A Boeing 737 had lost its roof at altitude and landed safely. But behind the miracle of survival lay the deeper truth. A complex web of maintenance decisions, inspection failures, and organizational blind spots that had allowed a critical structural weakness to remain undetected for years. As the sun set over Maui, the wreckage of Flight 243 stood under floodlights. The fuselage gaped open like a giant wound. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, began documenting every detail: the direction of the metal tear, the pattern of missing rivets, the thickness of the remaining skin, the discoloration along the lap joints. They quickly confirmed what Tompkins and Cain had not known in flight. The aircraft had been operating at the very edge of physical possibility. The decompression had been so violent that engineers were stunned it did not lead to complete structural failure. Had the tear extended a few more feet, had the pressurization failed differently, or had the aircraft been flying slightly faster, the 737 might have disintegrated entirely. While the passengers began recovering, the investigation moved with precision and urgency. What they would uncover in the next phases would reshape aviation forever. The legacy of Flight 243 was only beginning to unfold. Under the glow of portable floodlights, the wreckage of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 transformed from a scene of chaos into an open forensic laboratory. The aircraft rested in silence on the ramp at Kahului Airport, its torn fuselage resembling the peeled shell of a fruit. The violent loss of the upper cabin had left exposed wiring, insulation, and structural frames visible to anyone standing nearby. For investigators, this was not just a damaged airplane. It was a rare and invaluable crime scene written in metal fatigue, corrosion, and history. NTSB teams arrived overnight from Washington, D.C., joined by Boeing engineers and local FAA representatives. They moved slowly around the aircraft, photographing every inch. The first impression was immediate and alarming. The tear pattern along the fuselage skin did not resemble a single catastrophic rupture. Instead, it traced a jagged, meandering line across multiple rivet rows. The metal edges curled outward as if peeled by thousands of tiny hands. This was the signature of multi-site fatigue cracking, a phenomenon not fully understood in 1988 but feared by structural engineers. The aircraft had been in service for almost 20 years, flying nearly continuous short-hop routes between the Hawaiian Islands. Each hop meant a pressurization cycle. Each cycle meant stress. Each ounce of stress accumulated microscopic damage that spread invisibly under paint, primer, and corrosion sealant. The more cycles, the greater the risk. Investigators examined the lap joint near the missing fuselage section. The metal looked worn, fretted, and exfoliated. Corrosion deposits were visible with the naked eye. More troubling were the empty rivet holes, evidence that some rivets had completely detached prior to the incident. The joint had lost structural integrity long before April 28, 1988. By the next morning, the NTSB had already formed a preliminary hypothesis. The aircraft's skin had failed due to widespread fatigue cracks that had gone unnoticed during routine inspections. But the question was why? Aloha Airlines had a maintenance program approved by the FAA. Boeing had provided guidelines. Inspections had been performed. Technicians were trained. Yet somehow, all this structure, all this oversight, had failed to see that the very bones of the plane were deteriorating. NTSB investigators interviewed Aloha's maintenance personnel. Some described the routine visual inspections, the times they had noticed minor cracks near lap joints, and how those cracks were often addressed through blending, sanding down suspect areas until cracks were no longer visible. While blending had been an accepted practice at the time, it introduced a silent risk. If a crack extended deeper into the skin than expected, sanding the surface might hide the symptom while the disease continued to spread underneath. The NTSB began to see a worrying pattern. The more the surface was smooth, the more inspectors believed that cracks had been successfully removed. But beneath that polished exterior, microscopic fractures continued growing. Another factor emerged: the humid, salt-rich air of Hawaii. Aircraft stationed in coastal regions experience accelerated corrosion. For island-hopping carriers like Aloha, that corrosion was magnified. Maintenance schedules did not always reflect those harsh environmental conditions. In parallel, investigators interviewed the surviving crew. Captain Mimi Tompkins recounted the deafening blast, the violent decompression, and the struggle to stabilize the aircraft. First Officer Gordon Cain described the chaotic instrument readings and the difficult communications with air traffic control. Both described a moment-by-moment fight to keep a disintegrating aircraft in the sky. Their professional execution during the crisis would later become a case study in effective cockpit resource management, CRM, demonstrating how disciplined communication and coordinated task sharing saved lives. Ironically, the tragedy itself had roots in a systemic CRM failure, one occurring not in the cockpit, but across multiple layers of organizational decision-making. The NTSB expanded its scope. It analyzed inspection records, maintenance logs, and repair histories stretching back a decade. They found repeated references to skin cracks, lap joint corrosion, and skin fretting. Each notation seemed minor on its own, but when plotted on a timeline, the trend caused alarm. The investigation also focused on Boeing's original design. The early generations of the 737 had a particular fuselage joint design, one that relied heavily on bonding and adhesive layers between the skin panels. Over time, environmental exposure weakened these bonds. When the adhesive deteriorated, the skin panels relied entirely on rivets for structural integrity. These rivets concentrated stress. Stress created cracks. Cracks spread, and because the joint was layered, cracks could progress unseen under the lap. Boeing had been aware of potential long-term cracking in older 737 models and had issued inspection guidelines. But the guidance had not yet anticipated multi-site fatigue cracking on this scale. Aloha's aging fleet, subjected to intense short-haul cycles, represented a worst-case scenario. As forensic teams mapped the crack paths along the fuselage, they found dozens of initiation points. No single crack caused the accident. Rather, a web of tiny fractures, some no longer than the width of a fingernail, had merged, creating a catastrophic failure line. This finding was groundbreaking. Aviation safety programs at the time focused on isolated fatigue cracks, assuming that any significant structural defect would manifest as a single-point failure. Multi-site fatigue cracking challenged that assumption. It suggested that structural collapse could result from a network of small cracks rather than one large one. The NTSB's preliminary report highlighted inconsistencies in Aloha's maintenance program. While technicians followed FAA-approved procedures, many inspections were visual only. Given the extensive corrosion and bonding failures, visual inspections were insufficient to detect subsurface cracks. The environmental factor added complexity. Hawaii's humid, salty climate had accelerated the degradation of the fuselage skin and adhesives. Aloha's 737 fleet had some of the highest cycle counts in the world. Many aircraft exceeded 75,000 pressurization cycles, a record for that era. As investigators consolidated their findings, they recognized that Flight 243 was a perfect storm of environmental stress, aging design, maintenance limitations, and organizational complacency. No single factor could be blamed. The event was the product of an entire system that underestimated the risks of aging aircraft structures. Meanwhile, survivors of Flight 243 began sharing their stories with the media. Photographs of the aircraft's torn fuselage shocked the public. Engineers around the world expressed disbelief that any aircraft could remain intact after losing such a large section of its structure. The incident quickly became known as a miracle landing. But behind the miracle were the sobering truths uncovered by the investigation. One of the most emotionally charged moments of the inquiry involved the loss of flight attendant CB Lansing. Investigators were determined to understand the forces that led to her ejection. They calculated pressure differentials, airflow dynamics, and structural collapse patterns. They concluded that Lansing had been standing directly beneath the section of fuselage where multiple cracks converged. When the roof tore away, she had no chance. Her death became a symbol of both the human cost of structural failures and the heroism of airline crew members who stand at the front line of safety. As the NTSB moved deeper into the forensic analysis, they reconstructed the lap joint using aluminum fragments salvaged from the runway and the aircraft. Engineers compared the thickness of each skin layer, identifying regions thinned by corrosion. Some portions of the fuselage were significantly below design minimums. A metallurgical study revealed that the adhesive layer between the fuselage skins had been degraded by environmental exposure. The weakened bond had caused differential movement between skin panels, which in turn had concentrated stress along rivet lines. It was an intricate chain reaction, microscopic at first, but devastating over time. Human factors specialists examined the maintenance culture at Aloha Airlines. Technicians were dedicated and hardworking, but under significant pressure to keep aircraft flying. The airline's business model relied on quick turnarounds and high fleet utilization. Aircraft rarely spent long periods in maintenance hangars. Inspectors often performed their work on the ramp, outdoors, in bright sunlight or poor lighting, depending on the time of day. Such conditions made it difficult to spot the early signs of corrosion or hidden cracks. Interviews with maintenance supervisors revealed another human factor issue: organizational trust. Each technician assumed that the previous inspection team had addressed any anomalies. Over time, this created a sense of routine, an expectation that cracks were normal, manageable, and not indicative of deeper structural problems. It was a classic case of normalization of deviation. As the third week of the investigation unfolded, the NTSB released its interim findings. The cause of the structural failure was attributed to extensive multi-site fatigue cracking, environmental degradation of the fuselage skin, bonding failure in the lap joint, insufficient non-destructive inspections, organizational oversights and maintenance scheduling. Boeing and the FAA responded immediately. The implications were massive. Airlines around the world operated aging 737s. If one aircraft could suffer such a catastrophic failure without prior detection, others might carry similar hidden risks. Emergency airworthiness directives were issued. Airlines were instructed to inspect lap joints on older 737s using advanced non-destructive methods, including eddy current and ultrasonic testing. Entire fleets were grounded until inspections were complete. The fate of Flight 243 had transformed into a global wake-up call. Yet the investigation was not over. The final report would delve even deeper into the systemic failures that extended far beyond a single aircraft. As weeks turned into months, the NTSB investigation into Aloha Airlines Flight 243 evolved from a technical inquiry into a far-reaching examination of how the aviation system understands risk, aging, and human responsibility. The torn Boeing 737 remained in a hangar on Maui, guarded and preserved under tarps, its fractured metal skin serving as the central witness in a story that involved engineers, maintenance crews, regulators, and corporate decision-makers. What had happened in the skies above Hawaii was not just a structural failure, it was a structural revelation. Inside the hangar, investigators meticulously removed sections of the damaged fuselage for laboratory analysis. Every rivet, tear pattern, and corrosion streak was photographed, measured, and cataloged. They dismantled the lap joint that had failed, peeling apart layers like an archaeologist dissecting an ancient artifact. As each component was examined, the narrative of the accident became clearer. The airplane had not been destroyed by a single catastrophic flaw, but by thousands of microscopic ones. The term that surfaced repeatedly in technical meetings was widespread fatigue damage. This was not yet a widely used concept in commercial aviation at the time. Engineers understood fatigue cracking as a localized issue, something that could be detected and repaired before reaching dangerous levels. But widespread fatigue damage implied a different kind of threat, multiple cracks forming simultaneously across a large area, interacting with one another until they collectively reached a critical threshold. This understanding reshaped the investigators' perspective. Rather than asking, why did this single crack grow? They asked, why did this entire region deteriorate without being detected? It was a shift from focusing on individual defects to seeing the structural health of the aircraft as a system. In parallel, human factors specialists continued their interviews. Maintenance personnel at Aloha described their routines with honesty and frustration. They knew the airplanes were old. They knew corrosion was a constant battle in the islands. But they also described operational pressures, fast turnarounds, limited availability of spare aircraft, and a long-standing confidence that the 737 was rugged and resilient. It was this confidence, the belief that the aircraft could endure anything, that had allowed small deviations to become standardized. Hairline cracks between rivets were seen as routine. Surface corrosion was normal. The bond between skin layers was rarely questioned. The system didn't fail because people were careless. It failed because people were accustomed to seeing the airplane survive year after year, cycle after cycle. That familiarity bred complacency. As the investigation progressed, the NTSB realized that the cultural element of risk perception had been as destructive as the physical fatigue cracks. A maintenance culture had formed around the idea that the aircraft's age and usage were business as usual. And while individual mechanics were skilled, dedicated, and meticulous within the boundaries of their training, the organization lacked a holistic understanding of how all the factors, corrosion, cycles, environment, inspection limitations, interacted over decades. In the cockpit of Flight 243, however, the opposite had occurred. Captain Mimi Tompkins and First Officer Gordon Cain had demonstrated exceptional clarity under extreme stress. The NTSB requested the cockpit voice recorder analysis from the small fragment of audio that survived the explosive decompression. Most of the recording was lost to wind noise. Yet, brief snippets confirmed what survivors had already described. There was no panic in the cockpit. Tompkins and Cain maintained continual communication, cross-checking instruments, confirming settings, and verbalizing each action despite the overwhelming sensory overload. CRM experts, brought in to analyze the human performance elements, highlighted something important. The crew had resisted the psychological traps that often plague teams under stress. They avoided task fixation, they balanced responsibilities, and they acknowledged uncertainties rather than ignoring them. Their decision to divert immediately and their ability to manage airspeed with precision were textbook examples of high-performance resource management. In one part of the recovered audio, Tompkins's voice, distorted by wind, could be faintly heard issuing corrections to Cain regarding airspeed. In another fragment, Cain attempted to transmit a mayday call. The recordings were broken and incomplete, but they were enough to establish the discipline and cooperation that ultimately saved the aircraft. On the runway in Maui, the NTSB reconstructed the final moments of the flight. They analyzed touchdown marks, brake application points, and tire signatures. Despite the compromised aerodynamics, Tompkins had landed within acceptable parameters. Engineers from Boeing admitted it was one of the most remarkable controlled landings ever recorded under such conditions. But heroism in the cockpit did not negate the failures that preceded the flight. In the next phase of the investigation, the NTSB held formal hearings. Maintenance leaders, Boeing engineers, FAA officials, and aviation experts testified. The public followed the hearings with intense interest. Many had seen the shocking images of the aircraft, passengers exposed to open sky, seats inches from jagged metal rails, insulation shredded like paper. During the hearings, the NTSB chair summarized a key issue. If this aircraft had been operated on the mainland, flying 3-hour segments instead of island hops, we would likely not be here today. Pressurization cycles were the primary aging force, and the 737 involved was among the highest cycle aircraft in the world. While the airline maintained compliance with existing rules, those rules had not anticipated such extreme usage conditions. Boeing, while cooperative, also faced difficult questions. Why wasn't the adhesive bond between skin layers designed for more robust long-term durability? Why had inspection guidelines not been updated sooner to reflect mounting evidence of bonding deterioration? Why were non-destructive testing methods not mandated earlier for high-cycle aircraft? The FAA faced scrutiny as well. Regulatory oversight had followed a reactive pattern rather than a proactive one. Rules were updated only after incidents revealed weaknesses. Flight 243 revealed a systemic gap in aging aircraft management, and the FAA's response had to evolve beyond incremental changes. One critical moment in the hearings came when an NTSB investigator displayed a section of the failed lap joint. Under magnification, the rivet holes appeared oblong and worn. Adjacent cracks radiated outward like tiny lightning bolts frozen in metal. The panel's outer surface looked smooth, evidence of previous blending, while the underlying layers were riddled with damage. This airplane, the investigator said, was not a single failure waiting to happen. It was dozens of failures happening at once. This statement became the defining characterization of the tragedy. Outside the hearings, aviation analysts sounded alarms. If widespread fatigue damage could go unnoticed on one aircraft, what about the thousands of aging jets around the world? Was this a rare anomaly, or an indicator of deeper systemic risk? Airlines were forced to answer quickly. Fleets of older 737s underwent emergency inspections. Some aircraft were removed from service permanently. Regulators issued new guidelines requiring non-destructive inspections for all high-cycle airframes. Boeing began reevaluating its structural design assumptions for aging jets. Meanwhile, survivors of Flight 243 continued their recovery journeys. Many suffered from hearing damage, wind burns, and psychological trauma. They frequently praised the crew, especially Tompkins, Cain, and the surviving flight attendants, for their courage and calm. Memorials were held for C.B. Lansing, whose loss cast a long emotional shadow over the investigation. Her absence was felt not only by her colleagues, but by the flight attendants who testified during the hearings. They described Lansing as a mentor, a leader, and a constant in Aloha Airlines culture. Her death underscored the personal cost of structural failures that might otherwise be discussed in abstract terms. As the NTSB prepared its final conclusions, investigators recognized that the legacy of Flight 243 would extend far beyond improvements to 737 maintenance. It would influence how the industry approached aging fleets, environmental exposure, inspection technology, and organizational risk perception. The story of the aircraft that lost its roof was no longer just about a singular horrifying event. It was a turning point, a moment when the aviation community realized that time, cycles, and environment could conspire to undermine even the most trusted airframes, and that detection methods needed to evolve to match the complexity of the threats. The NTSB's final report would crystallize these lessons, rewriting the book on aging aircraft management and forever altering the future of airline safety. When the National Transportation Safety Board released its final report on Aloha Airlines Flight 243, it did more than assign causes. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the way the aviation industry viewed aging aircraft, structural integrity, and organizational responsibility. The document was forensic, technical, and deeply human, acknowledging both the extraordinary survival of the passengers and crew and the systemic failures that had led them to the brink of disaster. The report identified multi-site fatigue cracking, bonding deterioration, corrosion, and inadequate inspection protocols as the principal contributors to the structural failure. The fractured fuselage, torn open with devastating force, was not the result of a sudden anomaly, but decades of accumulated damage. The harsh Hawaiian environment, combined with the plane's exceptionally high pressurization cycles, had pushed the limits of the Boeing 737's early design. But beyond the technical findings, the NTSB emphasized human factors. They highlighted how the maintenance culture at Aloha Airlines, while diligent within its framework, had normalized minor deviations. Small cracks and corrosion marks were seen as routine, even expected in such an environment. Inspectors visually checked lap joints, but lacked tools to probe hidden layers. When blending procedures were performed, technicians believed they had addressed the problem, even though the deeper cracks continued growing. These conditions formed a tapestry of assumptions and habits, a collective blind spot that had unknowingly moved the airline closer to catastrophe with each passing year. The report did not assign blame to any single individual. Instead, it portrayed a system that failed collectively, inspectors relying on outdated methods, engineers underestimating environmental factors, regulators using rules that had not evolved with aircraft usage, and corporate decision-makers emphasizing operational efficiency without fully appreciating the cumulative strain on aging fleets. For the FAA, the report was a wake-up call. Immediately after the investigation, the agency issued sweeping regulatory changes that overhauled maintenance requirements for older aircraft. Airlines were now required to implement aging aircraft programs, which included mandatory non-destructive testing methods, such as eddy current and ultrasonic inspections, more frequent checks for high-cycle aircraft, revised corrosion prevention and control programs, rules ensuring that aircraft exceeding certain cycle thresholds received specialized structural reviews, enhanced record-keeping for repairs and inspections to prevent oversight gaps. The FAA also tightened oversight mechanisms, requiring airlines to comply with more rigorous maintenance audits and documentation standards. Aircraft manufacturers, including Boeing, were instructed to revise their service bulletins and develop new inspection criteria for aging structural components. In the engineering world, the Flight 243 event triggered a wave of research into widespread fatigue damage. Universities, design bureaus, and aerospace laboratories conducted experiments on aluminum alloys, rivet patterns, and bonded structures. Computer models were developed to simulate multi-site cracking and predict how fatigue networks propagate under different stress conditions. This new generation of research fundamentally changed how engineers designed fuselage joints and planned inspection intervals. For Boeing, the accident served as an intense moment of introspection. The manufacturer acknowledged that the original fuselage design, created in the 1960s, had not anticipated such extreme cycle counts. While the company had issued service bulletins on corrosion and cracking, they realized those communications had not adequately addressed the scale of degradation possible in certain operational environments. Boeing engineers examined ways to improve bonding durability, increase structural redundancy, and refine inspection recommendations for older aircraft still in service. This led to the development of improved lap joint designs and reinforced skin structures in subsequent aircraft generations. The 737 Next Generation, introduced in the late 1990s, incorporated lessons learned from Flight 243, including redesigned fuselage joints and more robust anti-corrosion treatments. For Aloha Airlines, the aftermath was both operational and emotional. The airline survived the crisis, but faced significant scrutiny and financial strain. They conducted extensive inspections of their 737 fleet, retiring older aircraft and investing in new maintenance practices. Yet, the emotional impact lingered. The loss of Clarabelle CB, Lansing left a void that no policy change could fill. She had been a cornerstone of the airline's identity, and her colleagues remembered her with profound respect. Her absence became a reminder of the personal stakes behind structural safety. Survivors of the flight formed an unbreakable community, bonded by an experience that defied imagination. Many spoke publicly about their gratitude toward Captain Mimi Tompkins, First Officer Gordon Cain, and the flight attendants who had fought through unimaginable conditions to keep passengers alive. Their accounts reinforced the extraordinary professionalism displayed in the cockpit. Tompkins and Cain were later honored for their actions, and their performance became a benchmark in CRM training programs worldwide. In aviation academies and training centers, the story of Flight 243 became a foundational case study. It illustrated the importance of communication, coordination, and quick decision-making under extreme stress. Trainees analyzed how Tompkins managed airspeed to prevent further structural failure, how Cain balanced instrument interpretation with external communication, and how the flight attendants improvised in an unprecedented cabin environment. CRM instructors used the event to highlight the dangers of fixation, the necessity of teamwork, and the power of maintaining cognitive clarity in crisis. Yet, the most enduring legacy of Flight 243 was its impact on aging aircraft safety. Airlines around the globe reevaluated the life expectancy of their fleets. No longer would an aircraft's age be measured solely by calendar years. Instead, cycle counts, environmental exposure, and maintenance history became critical variables. Regulators introduced the concept of aircraft aging curves, projecting structural health based on how often and where an aircraft flew. This allowed operators to predict when key components might reach critical limits and plan proactive interventions. Airworthiness directives stemming from Flight 243 led to modifications in countless aircraft. Inspections discovered cracks in other 737s that would have gone unnoticed without the new rules. In some cases, aircraft were retired earlier than planned. The incident raised awareness about the unseen risks of prolonged operational stress, shifting the industry toward a more preventative mindset. As the lessons of Flight 243 permeated through global aviation, the accident took on a symbolic meaning. It demonstrated that even in a world governed by sophisticated engineering, small cracks, whether in metal, oversight, or culture, could combine to create catastrophic outcomes. It highlighted that safety depends not only on machines but on the systems, decisions, and assumptions surrounding them. Years later, when aviation professionals discussed Flight 243, they often described it as a miracle. But within those conversations, they emphasized a deeper truth. It was not luck alone that saved the passengers and crew. It was the culmination of human training, engineering resilience, and the quick, disciplined response of individuals facing the unimaginable. In educational settings, instructors asked pilots to imagine what it felt like for Tompkins and Cain as the cockpit shook and the slipstream screamed through the torn fuselage. They asked maintenance students to consider the technicians who once inspected the lap joints, unaware that microscopic cracks were spreading beneath the surface. They asked engineers to visualize the complex dance of stress and fatigue across the metal skin. The story was both terrifying and inspiring. Terrifying because it exposed the fragility of assumptions. Inspiring because it demonstrated the capacity of ordinary people, trained, committed, focused, to perform with extraordinary strength under pressure. The ramp at Kahului eventually returned to normal operations, but for years, visitors who saw the rust-colored hangar where the 737 had once been stored felt an almost reverent unease. The accident site carried a quiet weight. It was a reminder of the fine line between routine and catastrophe, between a predictable flight and a fight for survival. When the NTSB ended its final chapter on Flight 243, they concluded with a statement intended not just for regulators, but for everyone involved in aviation. Aging aircraft structures require constant vigilance. Safety is not static. It is a living system that must evolve. This sentence echoed across the industry. And in the spirit of this message, airlines, engineers, and regulators worked tirelessly to build a world where the lessons of Aloha Flight 243 would never be forgotten. The accident became more than a case study. It became a turning point in the global philosophy of aviation safety. Today, every time an aircraft undergoes a detailed lap joint inspection, every time a high-cycle airplane is evaluated with advanced non-destructive tools, every time aging airframes receive enhanced corrosion protection, those procedures carry the legacy of Flight 243. The aircraft that lost its roof taught aviation a lesson written not just in metal fatigue, but in human resilience, systemic awareness, and the relentless pursuit of safety. Because every flight has a story, and this one, etched in the skies above Hawaii, became one of the most important lessons ever learned.